like we can come into places of conflict and actually begin to identify among ourselves what is important enough to us that we're willing to say, actually, our survival is not the most important thing. Like,
yes.
Our faithfulness is the most important thing.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Melissa. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here with you.
So this is Melissa Florer-Bixler. She is a pastor at Raleigh Mennonite Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And she's also the author of the book Fire by Night, Finding God in the Pages of the Old Testament. And I highly recommend this book, especially if you're like me and you nerd out over Hebrew scripture, or if you're just a fan of the Bible in general, you'll have to check it out. But today we're here to talk about Melissa's new book, and it is called How to Have an Enemy, which is a fantastic title, by the way. I love it. And you describe the book as this is a book about enemies, Jesus, and how the church is ordered by reconciliation. So we're going to be talking about enemies a lot, so it might be helpful. Like, how do you define enemy or enemies in the book?
Yeah, I wanted to be really careful about providing that definition up front. I'm glad that you bring that up, because if we don't know the terms we're starting with, right. I think that can be really hard. Like, I think my kids describe their relationship as one of enmity a lot of the time. I'm like, actually, you just don't get along. But that's, and so I think we do have this sort of, there is a way that this language can spiral on us, and we can start to name things as this is a relationship of enemies, or sometimes, this is just a relationship of conflict, where maybe it isn't actually a relationship of enmity. So wanted to really narrow the scope, and I'm fine. I'm saying one of the footnotes, I'm not here like to give the final definition for all time of enemies, but since we got it, like, language has meaning, and we got to roll with this for the rest of this book, you just have to like step with me into at least this definition of enmity, which is the way that I want to separate this from other relationships of conflict or discernment or struggle, is the role that power plays in that inner relationship.
Yes.
That there is something that has structured this so that you have one person who is empowered in some way over another. And so we call that relationship a relationship of enmity, and those are enemies. One has power over the other, and that power either leads to harm or destruction or abuse or violence in some way.
Right. Yeah, that's super helpful. And kind of the quintessential text that we turn to when we're talking about this is Luke 6:28, the passage where Jesus he tells people to love your enemies. And this passage has been used as a proof text for oppression, keeping people in their place, turning the other cheek, as kind of like this submissive acceptance of abuse. Yet you argue that this is a source of liberation. So do you want to dive into that a little bit and talk about the cultural context, so we kind of get our minds around what this actually was supposed to mean, and how it is an act of resistance?
Yeah, one of the things I love about that language of love your enemies is how this is the phrase that sort of draws together all of the actions that are happening in Jesus' life, right? So it's actually a description of every other thing that Jesus does. And I think in the Gospel of Luke is, one of those places where we really see this. And most sort of embedded in social and economic upheaval. So we automatically can like take off the table that love your enemies doesn't mean that you're in conflict with them, right? Because Jesus is in conflict with people all the time.
Right.
Right after the Beatitudes is this list of woes. Woe to you who, and so if there's a sense of, it means that we can never sort of identify where power is in our world and name that, that's just not true, right? So we have to see that like somehow love your enemies means all these other things that Jesus means. Mm-hmm. And so much of that is this this renewed creation, that this new order of being begins to flourish among actual human flesh and blood people on the ground, that the way that they spent their money and who they built social networks with and how they structured their families, all of that was sort of just cleared away to make space for this new thing, which we call the reign of God, which is that we actually owe it to one another, like how we spent, like that we're responsible for each other's debts, that we are supposed to get people out of prisons, that we ask these questions about the role of the state in violently shaping our imaginations for what's possible. Mm-hmm. So when I say love your enemy, and what I hear Jesus saying is, you love your enemy by making a new world that is a good world, even for your enemy, because our enemies are also trapped in these cycles of violence and vengeance, and to be trapped into those cycles is the sort of this perpetual source of enmity. We've learned how to disagree. That doesn't actually make the world new.
Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast, so I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. You referenced God's reign as a new ordering of creation. You were just talking about that. So how do you relate that to your activism work, both in and out of the church? Because this is kind of a radical shift. When you think of discipleship, you don't often think of like, let's burn down this order and create a new one. I mean, that could to some come across as pretty radical. So how do you step into that?
One of the real shifts for me and sort of understanding what Jesus is up to in the Gospels and what that means for us was actually coming across like finding my way into the abolition movement, which I talk about throughout this book. Right. Police abolition, prison abolition. And I think one of the first sort of myths I had to overcome for myself is that all the abolition, this work of the reign of God, is really about like taking things away. When instead we're actually talking about building a new culture. And so it's really interesting that you mentioned this as discipleship, because I think that's actually a really helpful way for us to think about discipleship is, how are we actually creating a culture of the reign of God that expands our imaginations besides what we've been given? So abolition helped me to understand actually that this creative process happens everywhere. So abolition, this work of building the reign of God, it doesn't just happen in, changing our police budgets, but it does there. It means that we parent our children differently, right? That we, it's this phrase, abolition starts at home, right? That we don't rely on punishment as the primary way that we interact with our children, because they go into the world and believe that punishment is like what we do when someone wrongs us, right? So actually everything that we do is sort of cultivating this a new culture of imagination for what is possible within the reign of God. And that actually sounds exciting, right? Like, I feel like I want to be a part of that.
Sure.
Yeah. So I know it's like, this book has like a kind of like, whoa, like this, like righteous anger and the work of peace. But I actually think it's a really hopeful book.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I kind of view myself as like a creative optimist in that, not that like life is all butterflies. I mean, I love butterflies, but but just that like the living into having an imagination to see the world differently as a source of hope and creative power. I love that. And so, yeah, I did see that hope in your book for a new world order. And so many people would say like, oh, you know, things are the way they are. And I just have no patience for that. I'm like, well, then let's imagine something differently. So I appreciate that call in your book. And I see that call also in Jesus, in his like third way of being in the world, where when he interacted with people and they gave him choice A or choice B, he was like, well, what about this? You know, pulled a rabbit out of it. Not really, but, you know, he didn't let them force him into one way of being. And but I have heard this kind of this critique, this pushback of the ways that Mennonites, this is a very Mennonite heavy podcast. I'll try to explain some of the cultural stuff that comes with Mennonites. But there's this kind of Mennonite moderate ethic of avoidance, being the silent in the land, not wanting to dive into conflict because we are not of the world, kind of this like separation of ourselves from community and that kind of activist discipleship work. So what I'm getting at here is, so how do we tap in to this third way as anti-oppression work?
I think this is where, and you tell me, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe part of this is that what is often sort of we're told is the third way is actually just a centrist position, or a compromise position, which isn't actually the third way. That's just a compromise. That's not,
or it's like this apolitical position of like, oh, well, we're above Democrats and Republicans because we follow Jesus. And you had a strong criticism for this idea of coming together and having communion after you voted, because like the people having communion together are not affected directly by the policies that they just voted for. And I was just like, yes. Okay. So how do we tap into that, you know, being affected by our politics and not just being this like game that we play in the polls? Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I was trying not to be too on the nose with this church that I love dearly, but Election Day Communion was born out of the Mennonite Church. Like that is absolutely a Mennonite program that has been picked up by other people. And and I think, you know, I've heard since then, you know, there are people who want to, you know, they have Election Day Communion to proclaim that Jesus is Lord. Mm-hmm. I understand, you know, so I want to be like, I try to be pretty direct that I think it is that sort of sense of somehow we are outside of the political. Because I think what has ended up happening, and this is for moderates and for Mennonites who have positioned themselves, what I would say is basically as political moderates, apolitical, which is actually, you know, if we're talking about like where people fall in terms of partisan politics, that's something like 60% of the people in our country fall somewhere in the middle, right? So this whole idea of like, oh, we're so divided. Well, I mean, 60% is like falls somewhere in the middle of this. And I think there is what I don't think that Mennonites have quite realized about that apolitical position is one, that it is an incredibly paternalizing position to take. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like we're actually the only grownups in the room because somehow we have actually figured out something that you all haven't, that these are two dangerous positions to be in, Democrats, Republicans, and we're, we have somehow, unlike you, have managed to sort of pull ourselves. And so we can give you our direction about how to act in the world. It's usually, and I think the second piece of that is that also means that Mennonites have very often, white Mennonites in particular, have very often found ourselves in a place of just total lack of self-knowledge. like, do you really think that there's like a position that you take outside the political? Like, there is nothing to which your labor and your taxes and your energy and your body is not tied into the system already. There's no outside. And I try to be pretty clear about that. You don't get to say, oh, I have somehow washed myself clean of these political categories. They've already figured out how to like include you into what's happening. So it's also just such a self-deception, in addition to just being very, very paternalizing.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And even saying, like, when you're saying, like, coming together and saying Jesus is Lord, there's nothing wrong with saying that Jesus is our hope, maybe a higher authority than politics, but that's still a political statement, at least like biblically wise. Saying Jesus is Lord is saying Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. So we can't check our politics at the church door. They're already in us. Like, we can't divide our life so neatly into religious, political, all of that. So I like how you're like, okay, we can't divide that up. So how do we be a political body well? And you also talk about anger a lot, which is kind of the antithesis of this kind of white, moderate, kind of wishy-washy, apathetic stance. So why, in your opinion, and from the work that you've done, why do you think that our society tends to react in discomfort, especially Mennonites, when faced with these strong emotions, with anger? Why do we feel like we have to fight that with, by silencing these angry voices and punishing this righteous anger? Like, I remember in response to some of the protests, this kind of tone policing of like, well, if they just wouldn't protest in this way, maybe we would hear their message. So how do you react to that in this search of how to have an enemy?
Right, and I'll just an even more recent example. We just had Constituency Leaders Council here for Mennonite Church USA, and one of the pieces of feedback from CLC was this resolution about asking for repentance for the harm and violence done to LGBTQ people. Was that it was scolding. That was the language that was used. So it's like there is this I do think there is this sort of dichotomy that we've set up, that the opposite of peace is anger. The opposite of peace is strong emotions. The opposite of peace is negativity or criticism. And so we have this, these sort of lines that have been already set up for us, that come out of white Mennonite acculturation. And if you divest from those, then you are not a person of peace anymore, right? And I've often wondered if this kind of circling back to where we started, if this has something to do with a long attended to focus in white Mennonite congregations of personal reconciliation as being sort of the place to put, like, we put a lot of eggs in that basket.
Yeah.
Right. And it has been Mennonites of color who have really pushed us in the past, since the 60s, to say, actually, we need to talk about the systems that, like, why is there conflict beneath this relationship? Oh, maybe there's this whole system of privilege and race and gender and heteronormativity that's actually like propping these up. And so without that, you're really just skimming the surface of what's possible.
Yeah, we have to confront why people might act violently on an interpersonal level. What are the roots in that? In that vein, you kind of talk about how there's a sense of futility in working for change at an interpersonal level, and that we've almost been manipulated into thinking that we can create change by kind of convincing our racist aunt that she's racist or whatever. Kind of like how companies are like, oh yeah, recycle, while they're like polluting the earth at alarming rates. So where do you see, is there a place for kind of that interpersonal bridge building, maybe even within churches, if there is a place, and when do you build bridges, and when do you burn the bridge down and kind of enter into that creative systems work?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mentioned in the intro to this book that for me, church is so local. Like I'm really speaking as a congregational pastor who does work on the ground every day. So for me, like, how do we actually create congregations that, and one example of this is that we talk about in the anger chapters, who are angry about the same things. Like how do you have a process that instead of saying like, oh, let's never be angry, well, can we at least be angry about some of the same things, and see if that anger becomes clarifying for us? Like Audre Lorde says, like a spotlight that
I love that.
Yeah, that actually and then it actually helps you to figure out, oh, who are the real enemies here? Like we're angry about all this stuff, but actually there's actually things that we if we're willing to sort of give space to this, that we can say, oh, we can be angry about the same things, and figure out how to make that anger productive and righteous and holy, and not towards our consuming destruction. So I think Mennonites have done amazing work with helping conflict resolution. But some of the most hopeful work for me is when that is done in the service of saying, oh, we actually see this as connected to a broader struggle. We're not trying to do this work in order to, make sure that everybody gets along in the room. Like, we actually understand that you really need skills to do conflict well in this congregation, and you just haven't done that. So I think Lombard Peace Center would be one of those places that just feels like such a hopeful place for me.
Right.
Because what they're actually trying to do is equip you with the skills to be able to say, how is our interpersonal conflict actually related to this broader struggle that we're in? And that seems like really good work for us to do.
Right. Yeah. And you bring up potential family ruptures that can come with following Jesus, because Jesus he talks about how he kind of makes this line, draws this line in the sand and says, I'm going to be on this side and I'm going to center these marginalized people. Do you want to come with me? And if we take those steps, if we move into that space with him, it could be at the expense of interpersonal relationship.
That's true. That's hard. That's true and hard.
Yeah. And some people, the choice is made for them because of their identity, and their families then reject their identity. And you want to talk more about that kind of line in the sand?
So I wanted to make sure that we recognize that the personal is always political, right? Those are intertwined for us. And I think that's sort of where Jesus is at with this as well.
Okay.
That we're actually moving into a new system of kinship with one another in the church. And so how do we take that seriously as congregations and as pastors? Like, what does that actually mean for the lived realities that we have on the ground? So, I just wrote this article about churches who are engaged in practices of paying off the debts of people in their church.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think like that is actually, it's the way the system is structured is that your rich parents will do that for you, right? Or your rich uncle, like that's what inheritance is for. And so if you are not born into some sort of wealth that propels you in that direction, you're saddled with this ever expanding debt, right? That's just multiplied by interest over time. So even this feels like a really hopeful place for us to be able to say, when we're talking about Jesus' disruptions of the family, it is not, it isn't into this void, like, well, good luck out there. It's actually our responsibility to be the other side of that. Like, oh, actually church becomes this place that cares about you when you are in for cancer treatments and make sure that you have the support you need when you're going through recovery, and like shows up for you over and over again. And I think this is, like you said, the other piece of that I think a lot of us who do come, like I do, from very stable nuclear family structures, is there are people all the time who have already lost a sense of belonging in their family. Right. And so even if they maintain that structure because they care about those people, it doesn't actually mean that that's the kind of nurturing relationship of unconditional love and care. Just because it's a licit relationship, like according to like what standards were given, doesn't mean it's healthy or whole or nurturing, right? And so that's what I think the other piece that I think especially as people who are in ministry, just that also needs to be on our radar.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about how like there's like this trope in like novels or like fantasy novels of like found family, where you get this like ragtag group of like often like bandits, and they're all kind of like misfits, and they come together and they find community, and that kind of connection that you were talking about. And I was like, oh my goodness, Jesus and the disciples, it's like the original like found family trope. So yeah, and I love the potential for the church to kind of do that found family work. I do want to bring up that you have an entire chapter on white supremacy, and you use the term whiteness. So I'm curious, kind of shifting directions here. I'm curious what the heart of that chapter is for you, and how this is essential work to the overarching thesis of your book and enmity and all of that.
I wanted to, at the end of the book, move into the places where Jesus explicitly talks about where in the old order we will locate relationships of enmity. Like what are those foundational pieces? So family was the first one. Okay. The second is money, mammon, and the third is ethnic or racialized identities that are often linked in a lot of ways to class or intersectional identities in some way.
Sure.
So wanted to take up the task of really digging into that, because that is a place of the primacy of how we have divided our world in the US especially. And so I really, the image that was brought to me both by Shanika Walker Barnes and by Willie Jennings as her prefaces that, is they really use the language of whiteness as a form of possession. And I think these metaphors that we use to talk about whiteness, about white supremacy, are really powerful. So I spent a lot of time reading and sort of trying to gather how, especially Black theologians were talking about what was the metaphor that they were using, And then how could I sit with that metaphor that was offered to me and then sort of see what emerged. And so those were the two people who sort of handed down that metaphor of a possession, of like a demonic possession. And what I really like about that metaphor, what's I think helpful about it, is it both tells us of the power and of this possession, of what whiteness does to us and to our world. It links it because, right, when we read about the demonic in the New Testament, we read about the work of Satan, of the devil, of the old order, right? It gets into everything. It's just not personal. It's interconnected with everything around us, but it also isn't essential, right? Like you can excise a demon, and it is already defeated. It is part of this world that is passing away. And the only reason it continues to have power over us is because we cede ourselves over to it.
Right.
Because we've made this deal with the old order.
Deal with the devil.
With the devil. It just feels like a really powerful and again, hopeful metaphor for me. I always worry about metaphors for whiteness that essentialize race. But also metaphors that make race feel like it isn't real. Something can be a construct and be very real, right? Like those are not separate from one another.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. I realized as you were talking that I think a lot of pastors and a lot of churches operate out of this kind of scarcity mindset of, if we do this work, we're going to lose so much. We're going to lose people. We're going to be divided. And it's kind of like a fear-based avoidance. How can we avoid that kind of scarcity mindset or work through it maybe, and recognize that, this is essential work and that we're not actually losing anything. We may gain, so much. I don't know. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, because our church went through this process. So, we've walked through this and and I do think there is that sort of practical thing, like we lost people and we gained people, right? But I think what it actually did for us, beyond the really important work of being affirming around clearly affirming around LGBTQ people for marriage, membership, and ministry, is that it also gave us the opportunity to say, this is like, we can come into places of conflict and actually begin to identify among ourselves what is important enough to us that we're willing to say, actually, our survival is not the most important thing. Like our faithfulness is the most important thing. And it just feels like this sense of, oh, actually we were called to be faithful. Like that was our and we were never guaranteed that our churches would stay open forever, that, this ministry would go on for 100 years. All we were promised is that the Holy Spirit would be with us, would comfort us, and would join us in this work, and would give us a constant hope, because that hope is rooted in something that can never be taken away.
Preach. Yes.
Preach on your podcast today.
Yes. I love it. Yeah. Thank you for that. Do you have any last advice for people trying to learn how to have an enemy, or any resources to share?
I have found it, that the resources of prison and police abolition, sometimes call it PIC abolition, prison industrial complex abolition, just to be really enlightening and hopeful for me, and are along with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black radical tradition are by far the things that have formed me the most. But the book that just came out this year We Do This Till We Free Us, by Mariame Kaba, who is known as Prison Culture on Twitter. That's sort of where she's done a lot of her advocacy work. I just finished that. We Do This Till We Free Us. And it was easily one of the most hopeful books, freeing my imagination once again and sort of rooting me down in Christ's peace that I've read in a long time. So I love that book. I would buy that book 100 times before you read mine. But also just finding your way into these organizational communities on the ground. Like nothing can really replace the work of people sitting around in a room and saying, how do we get people out of prison? And how do we dismantle systems of punishment? And what does actual safety look like? And how do we have safety without other people being unsafe, mostly people of color? So just encourage people to find your way into those circles and to listen well and to be a part of this work of the new world that Jesus has already given to us.
Yeah. Well, we have a tradition on the podcast of leaving our guests with a blessing. So is it okay if I bless you and our listeners?
Oh, I love it. I shall receive it.
Great. Melissa and all the listeners, may you go from this place and learn how to have an enemy. May you be drawn up into this creative work that leads us away from our fear-based moderation, and may we be a true light in the world. So go in that light and creative power and clarifying anger and all the things. Amen.
Receive it. Thank you, Mariah.
Yes, thank you for being on the podcast, Melissa. It's been a delight. Thanks. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.